This is Whitney Will from Star Hearth Astrology, and this is the rising signs in relationships. Each of these videos has two parts for each rising sign. The first part will focus on the synastry with that sign and its relationship to other rising signs in relationships of all kinds. And the second part will focus on the composites of whole sign rising signs. So we will begin each video with an exploration of the relational archetype of the sign itself before we even start relating. And this is important work because often I see couples in relationship readings, right? And it's really important to understand your partner as an individual and how they even relate to the idea of relationships and how inherently important or disimportant that is for their journey and the potential of what they're going to get out of it. Now, obviously, this is going to involve a detailed chart analysis and exploration and experience, but we can still pull some things just from the whole sign chart that speaks to the significance of relationships for each of the whole sign rising signs. We're starting with Aquarius, and here we go. Okay, so when we're looking at an Aquarius rising chart and asking, how do Aquarius risings have relationships? One thing that is very important to know in an Aquarius rising relationship is that Aquarius risings are inconsistent in their ability to be fully present in a relational way. So Aquarius risings, they need to retreat into silence, into contemplation, into a place where they're in relationship with themselves. Now, that can be frustrating and inconvenient if you need someone to respond to your texts on time. But the trade-off is when we come to the 7th house in relationships. The 7th house for Aquarius risings is the place of Leo. It is the place of the now and presence, because Leo is the sign that is embedded in what is currently happening. Aquarius is the sign that moves between the past and the future, that zooms out and tries to take it all in, that moves between questioning what their participation should be like, and so in many ways not being a full participant because they always have one foot in this observation space. So what they are experiencing, they are also observing. Now, the call into the present and the call into this kind of oneness, this wholeness of experience is in the space of relationships, is in the 7th house. I think that there is something essential in everyone's chart, in every rising signs chart, about where the Leo house is, because there's something about the Leo house that is the organizing principle of the chart. And now, I don't know where this comes from. In astrology, I don't think that this is an ancient way to think about it. This is my own kind of empirically developed way of thinking about it, that the sun's house ends up being this core place of understanding who we are. And Aquarians lose sight of who they are as individuals, except for in relationships, which they cannot always consistently show up for. So there's the paradox, right? And I think the metaphor kind of for this is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Now, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says basically that you can either think you know where an electron is, you can tell the story of where it should be, but if you check that it's there, if you send a photon to it, and you can check whether that electron is there by shooting a photon at it and seeing if the photon bounces off of it. But if you do that, there's no way to tell where the electron went from there. So you can either think you know where it is, or you can double check your knowing and lose it. I think there's something indelible about human experience in this metaphor that comes from quantum physics. But I think, right, you can either, both the Aquarius and the person relating to them can either think they know where the Aquarius is. If you go there and check and demand that they show up, you don't know how that call into presence is going to, where that is going to send them. Because Aquarius risings are ruled by Saturn, and Saturn is always looking at the beginnings and the endings, right? The bounded nature of things. It sits on the edge and it looks towards the center. And it sees the implications. So, right, there's a way in which relationships for Aquarius risings can be this delicious place of entering the present and being fully present when they're there. But they cannot always be there, which I think can be really confusing and upsetting for the people trying to relate to them. And just because they affirm that something is true when they are there does not mean that it will still be true later. Because once you zoom out, once they kind of jellyfish into this diffuse sense of self that is natural to Aquarius risings, other things can be true. Now, this doesn't mean that their feelings are true or untrue, but right, they are constantly going back to a kind of rationalism, a cold rationalism, that they're going to double check everything against. And so what they think is true is always evolving. Okay, that was pretty long-winded. We've got the seventh, this organizing principle that calls Aquarius risings into presence. So I think it can feel amazing to be in a relationship with an Aquarius rising because of that, because they get called into the leonine, warm, charismatic self inside of relationships. They also want a prize, right? You know, part of the seventh house is what we want in relationships, and wanting Leo is a prize, right? This shiny, beautiful, glorious thing, right? In the same way that Saturn wants to orbit the sun. They need each other, right? The cold Saturn-ruled Aquarians, with all of their perspective, still need to be charmed in to the inherent power and pleasure of being alive and feel the warmth of the self, even as Saturn questions it and provides the limitations to it, right? Astrology is not a story of parts. It is a story of wholeness, wholeness created by the interaction of parts, by the interaction of archetypes. Now, there is the 8th house, and we cannot speak about relationships without speaking about the 8th house. And the 8th house for Aquarius risings is Virgo. It is the place of shame, the place of perfectionism, the place of transmutation out of shame into a kind of humility. And this is a magical place for Aquarius risings because, right, in the context of another person, they can understand and analyze themselves. And, right, part of what is essential to Aquarius and Aquarius risings is behaving in an ideal way based on rationalism. And what is very important with the Virgo house is refining ourselves into the ideal. The shadow of the Virgo house is masochism, self-castigation. The virtue of it is the humility of daily practice. And that is one thing that relationships offer Aquarius rising, is the context for daily practice to be called into presence and to live by ideals and find out a way to place everything in existence inside the context of the whole, right? All darkness, all shadowy psychology. How can we fit it all together? How can I behold all the things about myself, right? I can be shiny and beautiful and think that you are shiny and beautiful in the context of the 7th. And once we get into the 8th, how do we deal with the inherent imperfection, dirtiness, and moral failings that exist just because we're humans? So there's the practice there. I also think that Virgo is the house of healing. And I think whenever we're talking about Aquarius risings, to have Aquarius as the rising sign is to have one of the most impersonal signs in the most personal place. And so there can be a self-alienation that must come from some kind of shame. And through the practice of coming in to safety, to psychological safety, to psychological health with another person, we begin to heal this alienation from self. Now, all the mutable signs are relentless. They are less of a thing or a symbol, and they exist as a process. And so, right, that's not to say that something is accomplished and then the work of the 8th is done, right? To be a fixed rising sign is to have your relentlessness, your mutable signs in the places that in the succedent houses that we like to be stable. So that with Virgo in the 8th, this work of refining ourselves in the context of relationships is indelible. And not just refining ourselves in the context of relationships, but refining ourselves in the service of relationships, right? Relationships will show us where there are faults. And if we can approach them with the humility, right, in healing the relationship, we heal ourselves, because the self is in the context of relationships, with Leo in the 7th. I've been speaking primarily about romantic relationships, but the 7th also has to do with client work. And part of the Aquarius Rising's kind of relationship to clients and client work, whether it's counseling or consulting or, excuse me, is to kind of take themselves out of the picture, right? That's kind of the Aquarius Rising thing. What do you need from me in your own context? And I think that this is one of the places where Aquarius Rising can really trip up. They think that in service to the other person, they need to not exist, right? That they need to put themselves aside to see the other person in themselves. And what that belies is an essential misunderstanding that a relationship, both people must be fully present, and that there's not, right, that your participation is essential in the relationship, right? You cannot, the relationship will feel lonely to the other person if you are keeping yourself aside and only serving what you think their needs are. So that's a big challenge. Of course, there are contexts where that's helpful. Professionally, it can be, right? And some places where it's essential, but it can definitely be overdone. And then they feel like they're not in a relationship with anyone, and then they disappear. And then when you come back from that time away in reflection, in that inconsistent presence, you're like, hey, what happened? There can be a lack of understanding of what you mean to others and how much value you have to them. Because as an Aquarius rising, there can be at times a disregard for self and an assumption that others have that same quality. Now, right, in the 3rd house is also a social house, our neighborhood, what is familiar, our siblings, our extended family, right? This is a house ruled by Mars and Aries. It's quick, it's fast, right? This is kind of like, there's a convenience to the relationships in these houses, right? They are mission driven, they are goal oriented. There's not a lot of bonding and closeness inherent in having Aries in the 3rd house, right? It's kind of like, yeah, we go on a mission together, we have fun together. When it's over, it's over. We're not consistent calling each other on the phone or worrying about that. Probably when you move from place to place, if you do, which all Aquarius risings have been doing with Uranus in the fourth since 2018, yeah, you might not keep in contact with these people because, again, right, the fire signs are very present. Same with the 11th, groups of people, right? The friend group, the political group, the allies, right? These are around belief systems and allegiance to the truth with Sagittarius. This is adventure. But Sagittarians, they are wanderers of their own accord, right? They are connecting with us with a common desire to seek meaning and truth and to explore, and to, in somewhat similar ways, put aside feeling. But again, not a super strong, sticky thing, right? Sagittarians and Aries, right? Willing to go. Now, there can be incredible exuberance and enthusiasm and warmth for the time being, but not a lot of like lasting forever power. Now, obviously, there are things that can overcome this. I'm not saying that Aquarius risings don't have long-lasting relationships. In fact, in terms of seventh house relationships, they might have some of the longest. Leo is a very loyal sign, right? And if your sense of self is attached to your relationships, that can be a boon of long-lasting things. The fourth house, parents and history, right? That is Taurus, something that was supposed to be, might not have been. Very stable, grounding, wholesome, material, rooted, right? I see Taurus in the fourth as a tree with deep roots, right? That's the family tree, right? The story of where you came from. And so normally there's a draw for solidity and safety in there, and the goal of serenity in the fourth. And we'll get into this, especially when we talk about Aquarius rising in composite charts, because right, when we're talking about long-term compatibility, we have to talk about the fourth house because that is where you live. That is where you come home to. And so having fourth house compatibility is going to be really significant. The fifth house, here's where you access play, playfulness, testing things out, experiencing things fun. And we've got Gemini here, right? Mind games. I think that, right, there's that connection of like mind experiments are so much fun, and kind of using the cerebral side of our nature, right? There's a mercurial nature within the fifth house. And so we see Aquarius risings, when they're accessing their most playfulness, they are going to channel a lot of different identities and a lot of different faces. And what's beautiful in the interaction with children is their ability to reflect these different sides in playfulness. Okay, so we've talked about some of the most significant relationship houses. Obviously, all of the houses have a relational aspect. If you're interested in this, Robert Hand's book, Horoscope Symbols, when it goes through the houses, discusses the relationships of each of the houses. It's very interesting. Okay, now let's talk about the house synastry between Aquarius risings and other rising signs. So I have never heard anyone else talk about this. But it seems absolutely essential to me that if our placements in certain houses orient our life with a specific thematic focus related to that house, for instance, right? A lot of 10th house placements, we would say that that person is very ambitious, regardless of the sign that it's in, right? If they're in a relationship with somebody that does not have that focus in their life, that is a point of incompatibility that will need to be negotiated and balanced in a different way if things are to work out. So, right, I mentioned before that the fourth house for Aquarius risings, right, this place that you come home to is a place that wants to be serene and harmonious. Taurus, ruled by Venus, stable. So when we're looking at compatibility, what other signs have that feeling in their fourth house? If you're talking about wanting to be with somebody and live with them for a long period of time. Okay, so let's get into it. One of the ways that I looked at this was to look at which signs share house rulerships. So what I mean by that is both Aquarius rising and Pisces rising have a Saturn ruled 12th. So, right, Aquarius rising has Saturn as the ruler of Capricorn, ruling the whole sign 12th house, and Pisces rising with Saturn as the ruler of Aquarius has also has Saturn ruling the 12th house. So what does that tell us? That's the biggest thing that they share in terms of house rulerships. This kind of, I think there's a fear of madness that is inherent in both Aquarius rising and Pisces rising, because Aquarius and Pisces are existing in a kind of collective consciousness more than a personal consciousness. And so, right, their ability to know who they are and to be oriented to the present and not kind of drowning in the amount of information that they have is in creating boundaries in the 12th house. Now, I think also when we have Saturn ruling the 12th, right? Saturn is a planet that speaks of the fear of failure in those boundaries, failure to not become overwhelmed. And the 12th house, when it overwhelms us, can disintegrate our structure, our Saturn, and then we fall into madness, the most devastating and fearful implication of which is that we cannot trust ourselves. We cannot trust ourselves in what we're thinking, in what we're feeling, and what we desire to know and be able to assess the world and our own safety. And so I think what Aquarius rising and Pisces rising share is that fear of losing themselves. Now, Aquarius rising and Aries rising don't share any house rulerships, but they do have this unique situation of Aquarius rising and Aries rising. And here, I'll pull up the chart so that we can look at this. So when we're looking at Aquarius rising and Aries rising, we see that they both have malefics, Mars and Saturn, ruling the 1st and 10th. So with Aquarius rising, we have Saturn ruling the 1st and Mars ruling the 10th. With Aries rising, we have Mars ruling the 1st and Saturn ruling the 10th. So these people are controversial figures, right? Whether it is publicly or personally, there is something that is problematic or tends to rub people the wrong way, they're intentionally going against the grain. We also know that whether an Aquarius rising or an Aries rising are have a day chart or a night chart, right? They are going to have their out of sect malefic ruling one of their key angular, public facing houses. And so there's something similar in the way that they approach the world with the kind of level of suspiciousness, right? And right, this kind of active quality of standing against something and knowing that, right, there are key pieces of them that are not quite likable. And in that, they can find solidarity with each other because they can trust each other to not need to be liked all the time. Now, one thing that they do share on the positive side, maybe it's all positive, right? We're talking about malefics, is they both have benefic ruled 2nd and 9th houses. So, right, they come into the space of having harmonious worldviews in the 9th, in their study and their exploration and their planning, having a positive and hopeful outlook, and generally having support in what they do despite these angular malefic houses. So that is an interesting piece. When we are talking about the Taurus houses, Taurus rising and Aquarius rising both have a Mercury ruled 5th. So there's a playfulness and a changeability and this kind of ability to meet each other, even in the context of 2 fixed rising signs, with this kind of playfulness in the 5th house, this willing to experiment. And then they also both have a Jupiter ruled 11th house. So, right, there's a deep compatibility, I think, in the friendship place and in the self-expression and mutual support for Taurus risings and Aquarius risings. Aquarius risings and Gemini risings have no shared rulerships, but they have the same elements in the same houses, which is to say, Aquarius risings and Gemini risings will all have the air signs in the same houses, 1, 5, 9, the water signs in the work houses, 2, 6, 10, the fire signs in the social houses, 3, 7, 11, and the earth signs in the shadow houses, 4, 8, and 12. So there's an essential compatibility. And when we talk about the composite charts, right, when you find the midpoint between air signs, air becomes fire, water becomes earth, earth becomes water, right? So there's a way in which a composite the composite signs between charts that have rising signs of the same elements create the freedom to transmute one way of functioning into another in the context of that relationship. And I will get more into that in part 2 of these videos when I'm talking about what happens in the composite between each of the rising signs. Now, Aquarius risings and Cancer risings. Here is where we come to the fourth house, because Cancer risings have Venus ruling the fourth. In Libra, they have Libra fourth houses. And so we've got this mutuality of Venus ruling the fourth. I want harmony, comfort at home, in balance, right? Home is this peaceful Venusian place. And Cancer risings have Aries ruling the 10th. So they similarly have a Mars ruled 10th. So I think right here is a great and deep compatibility. Despite these rising signs being quincunx or having no major harmonic relationship, they end up with angular houses that have the same rulers, that have, to some extent, the same ideals, right? I go out into the world and I champion my cause and I express my individuality and I work and I fight in this 10th house way. I make waves, I make changes. And in the fourth house, I strive for peace and stability and safety and comfort. Mars exists in my interaction and in the action that I take in the world, not in my home life. So I think that that is very important in terms of how they can support each other and understand where the action of the life happens and where the beauty and harmony need to be. So a deep point of potential compatibility. Now, with Leo risings, what we end up with is there's no overlap. They're not going to share anything, but they do have signs of the same gender kind of in there, right? So where similar with Aries rising, where there are air signs, there will be fire signs. Where there are water signs, there will be earth signs, and vice versa. So, right, they have a similar quality to each other, while not sharing other things. With Virgo risings, Aquarius risings will share a Mars ruled 3rd and a Venus ruled 9th. So, right, that is having this kind of harmonious view of things in the big picture, this love of learning, this love of knowledge, this real value of that, and right, a gift for kind of fighting it out, parsing it out in the 3rd house topics. With Libra risings, again, there is nothing exactly shared in terms of rulerships, but there is an elemental agreement. And I think with Libra risings, and I'll get into this in the composite charts, I think Libra risings are some of the best friends that Aquarius risings can possibly have. And a big piece of that is that with Libra risings, the composite ascendant is always going to be in Sagittarius, which is not only fun and exciting, but also the 11th house and the place of adventure and the place of movement and a place where Aquarius risings can really trust that Libran benefit of the doubt that comes in response to the kind of changeability and in and out of presence of Aquarius risings in relationships. Now, with Scorpio risings, Aquarius risings share a Jupiter-ruled 2nd house and a Mercury-ruled 8th, right? There is a kind of generosity born from this, right? There's a kind of easy come, easy go of what I have, kind of seeking to expand in the area of what resources mean. I think when we're looking at the 2nd house for Aquarius risings or Scorpio risings, that a lot of this has to do with their faith and their belief and not necessarily concrete resources. I think, right, one of the gifts of Pisces for Aquarius is this kind of faith that whatever happens is meant to be in some way, which I don't mean in this kind of predetermined way, but that there's something essential to be learned or offered in every experience, and that is its own kind of resource. That there, right, Jupiter will help you find a way. And I think similarly for Scorpio risings with Sagittarius in the 2nd house, that there is that resource exists, and it is based on a belief system and a desire to make meaning from experience. And when we come to the 8th house, what I think is so potent in that compatibility, and those both being Mercury ruled, is that the shadow of relationships is this place of fascination and conversation, right? That is not a place of faith. That is a place of analysis and discussion and ideas. And that, right, you can touch the things in that house. You can obsess over the things. You can go on wild goose chases in that house. And that both Aquarius risings and Scorpio risings deeply, deeply need another person to engage in that with them. And so that is a really potent kind of connection. I think that also having Jupiter rule your 2nd house is a boon, because there is a kind of, unless Jupiter is in a really, really bad position, there's a kind of self-confidence almost, this kind of assurance that paradoxically is required if you have these piercing, cold, rational malefics trying to carve your self-concept in the 1st house, in this unflinching, uncringing way, right? If that were too dangerous to do, you wouldn't be able to do it. And so, right, having the support of the 2nd actually makes it safe enough to engage in the meticulous drive that is having Aquarius and Scorpio in the 1st. So really, really potent connections, almost too potent, right? I mean, neither Scorpio risings nor Aquarius risings want to stay in that place of intimacy for too long. It's almost like they can dip their hands in it, really appreciate it, and then, you know, spend 9 months outside kind of brooding over what happened there. Sagittarius has, while it doesn't share anything, Sagittarius similarly has malefics ruling the 3rd house and benefics ruling the 4th and the 11th. So, right, the friendship house, right? Sagittarius is going to have Pisces in the 4th. So similarly having, right, the potential for the 4th to be a more benefic space, although I think that can be quite confusing to have the, as I talk about in the Sagittarius Rising as an archetypal life path video, having Pisces in the 4th is a groundlessness and a boundarylessness in the 4th house that can be really overwhelming and prompts the kind of flight of Sagittarius Rising, the going out into the world to find something else, because the 4th house is a really chaotic place. But can also be this place of deep faith and deep support eventually, once all of that is organized. And the 11th house, right, being ruled by Venus with the Sagittarius rising and Jupiter, right? There's a kind of way in which, right, we want positive, mutually supportive relationships with our friends. And so in a lesser way, that can be quite helpful. Yeah, and then as I said, right, we've got malefic ruled 3rds and 12th houses with the Sagittarius rising, and so the danger of those places. Okay, and then we've made it all the way back around when Aquarius rising is relating to a Capricorn rising. What they both have is a Saturn ruled 1st, a really kind of serious and engaged and mature focus on how they come into the world and how they express themselves. And what we get from that is that the work of refining the self is of utmost importance. And right, that can be a shared place. Now, it can be a little bit hard to relate from that place, especially if they have heavy Saturns, because there can be boundaries and withdrawal and a kind of aloofness that can make it hard for them to reach out to each other. There's this kind of expectation, right, that comes from Capricorn risings having Cancer in the 7th and needing nurturing from other people. And Aquarius risings having Leo in the 7th and this kind of being called into presence by other people, where they can't quite do that for each other because they are unwilling or unable to kind of reach out in that closeness. But when they do come into contact, sharing notes on how to be a child of Saturn can be really helpful, because they share a common language about a Saturnian self that they don't share with any other signs of the zodiac. So that's what I have for you on relationships with Aquarius Risings, whether you are one or are in a relationship with one. In part 2 of the rising signs and relationships, Aquarius Risings, we will go over the composite rising signs that it is possible to have within an Aquarius and how that can show up in the quality of relationships and the kinds of relationships that are possible and probable for Aquarius Risings. And based on the type of relationship that you might want to have with someone, you know, what you are possibly looking for in a partner and how all of that shows up. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's really heady. I know this stuff is a lot of analysis and really heady. And this is also the first one that I have made. So if you have tips and pointers, if you want more charts and more explanations, if you have questions, if you have reflections, please put them in the comment section. And if you liked it and it was helpful, please let me know and please share it with other people. Thank you so much for being here. If you want help on your relationships or more insight into your personal chart, Aquarius Rising or otherwise, I do relationship readings and couples work and family work. You can find the information on my website at starhearthastrology.com. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you soon.